Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my Total War Warhammer Missing Legendary Lords Beastmen edition. And today we are going to be looking at mostly the Legendary Lords from the Beastmen that were included in the 8th edition of the Warhammer game, because that seems to be where Creative Assembly is getting most of their inspiration from for Total War Warhammer. So that's where we're getting the lords from. There may be other characters amongst the Beastmen lore and history that I'm not necessarily including today, but that's just because they haven't been included really in the latest edition, so it seems unlikely at this stage of the development of the Total War Warhammer game that they will be included. But there are a couple of exceptions I've included from earlier editions even, in today's video, and I'll highlight those when we get to them. Let's kick things off, shall we? And we are starting with the one I am most looking forward to, I have to say, Taurox. The Brass Bull, the Slaughter Horn, the Blood Beast. Now, Taurox was a mighty Minotaur chieftain in his own right when people first started to notice him in the Warhammer world. He struck down any foes who faced him. He was notoriously not necessarily vindictive, but angry, and would fell any opponents who would make any form of eye contact with him, which one could equate to some kind of sociopathy or something like that. There's definitely something not right in his head, but if you made any eye contact with his stern visage, he would just strike you down there and then. And this led to him being known for always having blood-soaked feet, whether it be through the blood of his enemies or the blood of his allies. Now, due to this sort of imposing nature and his strength and his ability as a fighter, he very easily managed to impose his will on any other lesser beastmen, thus quickly building up a war herd of his own for which he marched through most of the different areas of the Empire. But at some point, he tended to find himself in the Great Forest area of Talabakland, as highlighted here. And he started sort of roaming and reaping and rampaging around this area for a fair amount of time, gathering a war herd to him and challenging any other war herds that stood in opposition to him as well. It got to the point that his rampage of carnage across the Great Forest had drawn the attention of the Fell Powers and the Chaos Gods themselves. To this point, they wanted to sort of open up a channel of communication with Taurox, see if they could maybe guide his lust for destruction and murder into a way that would be more useful for them. So one day after a battle, Taurox is standing over one of his enemies, and a hand starts to form out of the visceral intestines and blood of one of his fallen foes, and that hand starts to form an arm, and eventually this foul emissary creature made of blood and sinew is crawling out of the remains of this body. Now, Taurox, not necessarily being one for words, sort of stands there stoically in silence watching this happen in front of him, but much to the emissary's error, as soon as he formed a head and a mouth and was about to open up his proposal to Taurox, he made the mistake of making eye contact. And as soon as he made eye contact, Taurox, with his disorder where he doesn't like anyone making eye contact with him, immediately attacks, grabs the emissary by the throat, and in one foul swoop, bites off his head. Now, he has his war herd around him at this point, and they're slightly bemused that he, without realizing or interacting with this object, Taurox had bit off its head, and ever since he'd done that, had just stood there as still as a statue, in complete silence, not uttering a word or moving a muscle. And then suddenly, he starts to convulse violently and collapses on the ground. Now, during his convulsions, he's tearing at his own flesh, he's biting himself, and Taurox has a vision, and it's a vision of a world awash with blood and afloat with corpses. Eventually, after sort of tearing at himself and convulsing horribly, and his warherd gather around him out of concern, he wakes up and just goes crazy. He grabs his 2 axes, he starts just hacking down his own war herd, hacking down anything near to him. Eventually, after a few hours, he's completely annihilated his entire war herd, killed every single beastman he had gathered under his banner, and his rampage doesn't stop there. He rampages and kills anything he finds. He comes across covens of witches, comes across mercenary ogres, wandering bands of human merchants, just soldiers, troops, anything and everything that happened to cross his path as he was carrying on this rampage around the great forest of Talabaklan was struck down in very quick succession. After a year and a day, he reaches the small town of Liebstedt. Now in Liebstedt, he kills every single citizen he comes across, and again, it's just continuing this year-long rampage of murder and bloodlust that was driven on by him eating the head of the Fell Powers, this emissary they'd created to talk to Taurox. So eventually he's killed so many people in this town of Liebstedt that an actual river of blood has started to form at his feet. The blood is just pouring down the main streets of the town. And Taurox is there, and having spent this year rampaging around non-stop, finally his last ounce of energy and life is really spent. And he collapses into the river of blood and sinew, exhausted and dead. The Fell Powers, having very much enjoyed the rampage they've witnessed over the last year, have decided that that's not the end of Taurox. That's not the end of the potential carnage he can reap upon the world. Under the scarlet moon of that evening, they resurrect Taurox, and blood is still flowing from his massacre of the town. He wakes up in the river of blood of his own making, with a new brazen metal body. And the gods had blessed him with this new body, a body that would no longer tire, that would never run out of energy, that would allow him to keep killing to his heart's content and give him no respite from his constant state of rage and bloodlust. And as he stood up, he put his hands into the river of blood that he'd created earlier that day and drank deeply from it. And within his stomach, the pints of blood he'd consumed began to boil within his metal frame. And soon he had gathered a brand new host to him. His new frame making him a Minotaur of legend, and had obviously had the blessing from the Fell gods. And it wasn't long before he'd gathered another huge host to him. But this time he obviously had a modicum of self-control, and was not just slaughtering them all upon seeing them. He'd regained some of his mind and was able to think strategically as he had done before eating the head of the emissary. So he's gathered this huge host to him, and at its head are a huge column of armored minotaurs, said to, when in march, spread themselves a mile long. That's how many minotaurs he's called to his new army. And whenever they get the scent of flesh, they are prompted to rush off in a frenzy stampede into that direction, leaving a trail of destruction behind them. They are still in Talabakland at the moment, around the region of the Great Forest, and they've been causing ruin and destruction amongst a number of different settlements. The Empire has sent out some outriders to follow their trail, and the riders, whenever they arrive at a site of this destruction, whether it be a flagellant camp, or a temple to Sigmar, or a temple to Ulrich even, they just find blood smears on the walls, no signs of bodies, no signs of anything else. And if their investigation holds true, the trail of destruction seems to signify that Taurox is heading right towards the capital of Talabheim. This is where he seems to have angled his rage and lust for blood and destruction. Now, Taurox's transformation wasn't completely finished. He wasn't fully metal. There is a vulnerable point on his throat that can still be struck. So it is still possible to kill him, despite the fact every other sort of inch of his skin is completely made of metal, and thusly has given him a huge amount of armor and made him near indestructible. So that's how Taurox became the roaring, snorting engine of destruction he is today. The sort of grotesque musculature of a Doombull general, covered in its metallic skin, leaving him virtually invulnerable, save for the one weakness I mentioned earlier. Now, Taurox himself has 2 horns, obviously, as any Minotaur, but they're bladed at the end. He somehow managed to embed blades into the ends of his horns. His teeth and mouth are also made of metal, and it's become this sort of gnashing metal maw for which he eats things alive and drinks deeply from pools of blood he's created. So essentially, Taurox on Total War Warhammer, I think, would have to be amongst, if not the best melee lord the Beastmen can offer. I think he'd need to do more damage than maybe even Kazarak. He'd just need to be a complete engine of destruction. I think if they do introduce Taurox, it will be with the addition of Doomball generals to the Beastmen army, which is a type of general they don't have as of yet. And very much looking forward to seeing him in the game. Obviously, he has, in terms of his gear and stuff, he has his brass body, which gives him a crazy amount of armor. He also has his 2 axes, which are known as rune-tortured axes. And these axes have burn on them. They have the ability to burn whoever they strike. They're magic weapons as well. And on the tabletop, you can't make armor saves against his axes. So they'd have to be heavily armor-piercing axes as well. So as you see, with that combination of his kind of strength and armor, he really could be a complete machine. Maybe having a susceptibility to magic, maybe something like that, just to make him not completely OP. But yeah, as I said, on the tabletop, the gap in his brass armor around his throat was actually a weakness. And if you rolled 2 6s on 2 dice in a row when you were looking to hit him, that would actually kill him instantaneously. So I'm not sure if they would find a way of making that mechanic play out in Total War Warhammer, that if something very untoward happens, he sort of dies instantly. I don't think that would be fair. That's sort of the aspect of randomness. It's often on the tabletop, but would be hard to incorporate in a Total War game. So essentially, you're just making him a complete monster and melee machine. And that about sums it up for Taurox. He is a great character. He never had a model on the tabletop, so CA are kind of able to do whatever they want in terms of the way they eventually want him to look. But I look forward to seeing what they do. He's also a sort of crowd favorite in the Warhammer communities, so hopefully he will be added one day to Total War Warhammer, and very much looking forward to having a campaign as Taurox, the Brass Bull, the Slaughterhorn, the Blood Beast. Next, we have Gorthor the Cruel, Gorthor the Beast Lord. Now, Gorthor is known as the most famous of the Beastmen sort of leaders. He was said to have been alive around 1,000 years before the start of Total War Warhammer, during the time of the Crusades. So a number of knightly orders and melee infantry and stuff have all gone south from the Empire and are currently in Araby fighting, leaving the Empire relatively undefended, missing a lot of its best troops. So now Gorthor was a beast lord who inhabited a region of the map known as the Middle Mountain. Now the Middle Mountain on Total War Warhammer is the area of the map where you find Brass Keep and Hockland, really. It's around that Hockland-Ostland area that you often see in Total War Warhammer. So that's the region he's from. He's sort of from that mountain range. And Gorthor was looking to build a beast herd unlike any other that had been seen. And so he started to go about challenging all the other beast lords as soon as he felt strong enough to take them on. And he handily defeated them and killed them and started to gain a huge reputation as the strongest of the beast lords. So, having defeated a number of opposing beastmen lords, he began to amass what was later described as the biggest war herd ever witnessed. He not only slew any opposing lords who stood in his way, but he also committed the sin, and it's regarded as a sort of sin in the Beastman world, of killing any Bray shamans who opposed him as well. And he in fact wanted to prove his power so much that even after killing the Bray shamans, he wanted to prove to his other beastmen that he wasn't scared of the notion of the curse that one would come under if one ever killed a Bray shaman, that he in fact wove their pelts together after having skinned them and made them into his own cloak. So he's amassed this huge army, and then he gets about the work of creating an army that can destroy the realms of men. Gorthor at this point believes he is in fact, chosen of the fell lords, the gods of chaos. He will be the vessel with which they destroy the empires of man and return the forest to the control of the beastmen and their kin. To a certain degree, this has proven true, as during some of his battles, a dark aura is known to envelop him and strike out with black lightning, kind of, at any of the foes who try and attack Gorthor. So he has this sort of cloaked magical aura that is brought on by his affiliation with the Chaos Gods. But he's not stupid. This is one of the defining and best aspects of Gorthor and why he did become one of the Beastmen of Legend, not unlike Kazarak, who is very much an allegory of Gorthor who's alive today. He's very much known for being sly and cunning and using strategy, whereas the Beastmen in general are usually mindless and just tend to charge at the enemy and not really think too much about it. But Gorthor was very different. He thought about his actions, he planned, he really looked to see himself as the Beast Lord of Beastmen and take down the empires of men once and for all. So he didn't just charge down the mountain as soon as he'd amassed the numbers. He started his war herd for preparing for war. They started to build chariots. They started to bait harpies down and trap them and ensnare them in their armies. Same goes with razorgors. Some say they managed to collect and tame and use razorgors the size of mammoths within their army. He even constructed a chariot for himself because he didn't want anyone else in the battle to be the first one to be able to spill blood. And on his chariot, he often had his sort of servant or ally or friend even, Bagra, who was always accompanying him on the chariot. And you can see him on the model on the left. So once this army's prepared, they've tamed the harpies, they have their massive razorgors, they've recruited gorgons, they've recruited cygors, they have giants. This army is ready to go, and it marches out of the middle mountain into Ostland. And it's said that this horde is so vast it stretches from one horizon to the other and starts to terrify the realms of men. Ostland starts to be ravaged. The armies set about it and just completely ruin every town, city, camp of humans they come across. The beastmen eat their fill from the guts and brains of any humans they meet, and Gorthor himself always insists on leaving one man alive so that he can go and spread the message of their arrival to the next village, and so on and so forth. So there's this wave of fear that follows this enormous beast herd marching out of the middle mountains. And the slaughter is indiscriminate. He kills women, he kills children. Nothing can seemingly stand in his way. The Count of Ostland is at his last sort of wits. He doesn't know what to do. And at that point, once Gorthor feels he's ravaged Ostland enough and there's nothing really left to ruin, he decides to march the horde south. And at first it's not immediately obvious where he's heading apart from into Hochland, and then they realize he's heading straight for the capital. He's going to Hergig. But before he can even set the middle mountains behind him, before they even pass over the horizon, Gorthor is met with a huge army of Black Orcs who are blocking his path. At that point he has a sort of convulsion. He believes he has a revelation granted to him by the Chaos Gods that this is a test for him. If he truly is to be their chosen, he needs to prove that he can defeat this army of greenskins. And so he sets about trying to destroy this army of greenskins. Now, greenskins versus beastmen, no one's really employing much strategy. So they both rush at each other into this huge melee, just grinding down to slaughter each other. And indeed, Gorthor challenges the Black Orc warlord to a duel. Now, the Black Orc warlord is a towering monster. His name has been forgotten through the annals of time, but it said he towered over even Morgor, who was the largest of the Beast Lords, and they went into and engaged in a furious duel with Morgor's famed spear slashing and darting and diving and twirling, and the Black Orc warlord hacking at him with his axes. And they landed and parried blows off each other that would have sliced any other foe in two with a single strike. It said that this had happening on the battlefield, and their fight got so fierce that everyone had to back up about 20 paces, because if you were anywhere near any of their swinging blades or swinging spear, you were just going to get cut down. It was just that fast, that furious a battle, that furious a duel between the two of them. And finally, Morgor is sort of hit down, and he thinks he's about to lose, and he says he has another vision from the Chaos Gods who tell him, think of this orc as one of the challengers, one of your Beast Lord challengers, and attack him thusly. And this sort of seems to inspire Gorthor, and he stands up renewed with energy and vigor and manages to swing his spear so it slices into the green pointy ear of the Black Orc warlord and passes through it like butter straight to the other side, even as his scalp starts to slide off the top of his head. The warlord still manages to let out an enormous roar of "Wah!" before he collapses on the floor dead. Morgor then proceeds to trample his body until it's just green pulp under his hooves, and this disheartens the greenskins to such an extent that they just run and scatter. But due to the speed of the beastmen, they run them all down and slaughter them to the last Black Orc, leaving none alive and winning a victory that day. Now, they did suffer some casualties, but just due to the innumerable size of the horde, it really didn't make a difference, and they continued on their march to Hergig. The delay that these Black Orcs caused did allow the humans time to recoup and maybe regroup their forces a little bit. In fact, the Count of Ostland, with his few remaining soldiers he'd had left after the ruination of his province, had the idea to try and reinforce Hochland, and maybe if they stood together, they'd be able to fight off this horde once and for all. But Gorthor, being the sly beast lord that he is, had armies watching the roads, and upon seeing the remnants of Ostland marching towards Hergig, ambushed them and killed every last soldier to the last man, meaning that Hochland was very much on its own and had to defend itself. The Count of Hochland at this time was a man called Michael Ludendorff, and he was a ruthless and iron-fisted ruler. He wasn't known for his kindness or generosity, just his stern aspect and forthright nature. And perhaps this is the kind of attitude that was needed to fight a foe of this power and strength. The thing that Mikael did was immediately he started to ignore the cries from the countrymen, from the farmers and the province as a whole, looking only to enforce and fight from the capital itself. He allowed the slaughter of anyone who didn't get to the capital to go ahead. His sole focus was fighting them off at Hergig, and Hergig was the only place they strategically, from his point of view, stood a chance of defeating this horde. If they met them in the open field, they would just be overwhelmed with the numbers and be slaughtered indiscriminately. So he sets about the defense. His first order of business is to split his forces. So he has all his foot soldiers and everything else form the defense of Hergig. But he does want to harangue and harass the beastmen as they approach the city. So he sends out all his pistoliers and outriders, not to get caught, but simply ordered to do shooting raids, quick and simple, on your horseback, ride in, shoot some beastmen, ride out, run away, ride in, all the way to harass and harangue the beastmen horde until they got to the capital of Hergig. And in Hergig itself, he had man, woman, and child, citizen and soldier alike, working furiously day and night to enforce the defenses. He had them building weapons, he had them building artillery pieces, he had them building traps and snares that they built around the countryside all around Hergig. They burnt the forest around the town just to make it a clear range of fire for all their artillery pieces and all their archers. Every iron pot, every spare piece of metal they could find and track down was ripped from walls and fences and whatever have you and melted down to build more weapons, more arrowheads, more bolt throwers, all these kind of things to better reinforce the defenses as they stood in Hergig at the moment. So having gone through all these traps, having sort of fought off the Pistoliers and the Outriders, the horde of Gorthor finally arrives at Hergig. Although they have taken casualties, although the Count had sort of poisoned all the wells and burnt any excess livestock or anything that the Beastmen could eat on their approach to Hergig, and they'd lost many to the traps and snares and the bullets from the Pistoliers, the horde was still just of such vast size that it seemed a hopeless battle. But nonetheless, the stern aspect of the Count of Hochland stood firm, and he did not balk at the size of the army. And any who tried to run or flee the city, he'd order killed as traitors to the province of Hochland. So, the Beastmen set about their business of trying to smash down the gates of Hergig. And it takes them a while. All the traps and all the defenses and all the archers on the walls. And essentially it takes them 3 weeks of fighting until finally a stampede of razor gores, said to be the size of barns, finally managed to breach the gates of Hergig. And as they came in, it caused panic within the city. Citizens were being slaughtered on the streets, but many soldiers and regiments had organized in the larger houses that stood as kind of bastions that they'd managed to barricade themselves in and would fight the Beastmen as they ran through their own streets and held out that way. And for 3 nights and 3 days, battling within the city continued. They even managed to hold out in houses, units of halberdiers just barricading doors, stabbing beastmen as they tried to crawl through broken windows and broken doors, and just trying to survive and fight for their lives. So as the fighting in the city continued, Count Mikhail retreated to his palace, and he ordered, and as his forces started to dwindle over the 3 days and 3 nights, he ordered his archers to start shooting flamed arrows into the town of Hergig itself, setting the town ablaze and killing any Hochlanders who'd been sheltering in their basements, trying to escape the ravages of the Beastmen horde, as well as killing huge numbers of the Beastmen in the fire that caught hold of the city itself. In explaining his actions to his fellow soldiers up in the palace, which is where he was now, he said, "Any Hochlander not up and fighting and cowering in an attic was no Hochlander at all." And that's how he approached that issue. And it did cause huge amounts of casualties to the Beastmen, as well as killing any remaining Hochlanders who had been cowering in their homes and in their places of business, trying to avoid the Beastmen rampage. Eventually, once the Beastmen were in the city, an advisor to the Count suggested that they surrender. The mere suggestion of this idea made the counselor, this had been a long time counselor of the Count, bear in mind, and some would have thought they were friends, but caused the Count to send this counselor out of his presence, saying, "You are more Beastman than Hochlander, and you are better off out there with your kind." And he essentially told him to go and surrender himself to Gorthor. Gorthor, looking to take advantage of this little dispute, actually offered the counselor freedom. He said, "We'll let you leave, just help us find a way into the palace," which is where the Count had barricaded himself in and had been managing to hold out with the remainder of his forces. The counselor, despite what the Count had done to him, was still a loyal man of Hochland and refused, at which point Gorthor ate him alive there and then on the spot. As Gorthor had managed to whittle down the resistance within the city, he began to gather his war herd at the gates of the palace entrance, prepared to storm it and to finally kill the Count of Hochland, who at this point had enraged him so much, he'd promised his beast herd he wouldn't take any of the humans in the city for himself. They could have everything. All he wanted was the head of the Count. So they've amassed their armies, and the sun starts to rise at the end of the 3rd night of their fighting within the city. And as it is, Gorthor starts to order his troops to batter down the gates of the palace. And at this time, the earth around Hergig begins to shake, and the Beastmen horde, who are so vast that they are both outside and within the city, start to wonder what's going on. And in fact, over the horizon, as the sun rises, the Knights of the Blazing Sun have arrived. They had word from down in the Crusade, and their entire order had returned north to quell this Beastmen uprising, and they'd arrived just in the nick of time. And stampeding towards the city of Hergig, they smashed into the rear of the Beastmen horde, slaughtering thousands upon thousands of them, and coming in to reinforce the city. Gorthor at this point orders his herd to march out of the city, take on these newcomers into the battle, and to kill them all. Seeing his opportunity to surround and to effectively use a hammer and anvil on the armies of the Beastmen, Count Mikael marches out the remainder of his forces as well. As Gorthor finds himself surrounded on both sides by the Count on one side and the returning Knights of the Blazing Sun on the other, he doesn't know what to do. He knows he has to think of a strategy and a way out, and he climbs a sort of broken down statue of the Emperor that had stood in one of the squares of Hergig, and he started to shout towards the heavens, or not the heavens, towards the Chaos Lords, Chaos Gods, saying, "Gods, what shall I do? What action shall I take? Please help me." And he gets a vision and he charges down and he says to his hundreds of bestigors who formed his personal bodyguard that we had to fight our way to the Count. We shall kill the Count and the day will be ours. And they charge to her, and the bestigors cart a swathe of bloody retribution towards the Count of Hochland. And finally, Gorthor gets him and meets him and challenges him to a duel, as he had done with the Orc warlord previously. And the two of them enter into a fight. Gorthor armed with his spear, the Impaler, the Count with his runefang and shield and old ancestral armor. And they launch into a fierce battle amongst the two of them. The Count fighting off the Beastmen Lord, who towered several feet above him and rained down blows that would have surely killed any other human. Eventually, Gorthor's fury reached such a zenith that he managed to summon the strength to shatter the Count's shield and rend his ancestral armor in two, skewering him through his torso. In a spate of victory, of sort of drunken bloodlust, Gorthor sets about putting all his strength behind lifting the body of the Count aloft to show it off to his soldiers and hopefully break the morale of the Empire. And he sort of grabs his pole with the Count on one end and starts to lift it. As he lifts it, the Count's body begins to slide towards Gorthor, and out of the corner of his eye, he sees the Count Runefang lunge at him, seemingly under the guise of its own power rather than the strength of the Count's arm itself. And the Runefang slices Morgul across his chest, wounding him mortally and eagerly drinking up the blood of the Beast Lord itself. And that's where they both met their end, the Count of Hochland and Gorthor face to face, having managed to slay one another. At this point, seeing Gorthor dead completely shatters the morale of any of the remaining Beastmen horde, and they run out of the city. The forces of the Knights of the Blazing Sun, although had caused massive casualties to the Beastmen just due to their sheer numbers, the fact they had Gorgons, Cygors, giants in their numbers, had also suffered huge defeats, and just with the remaining troops left in Hochland, and even just the remainder of the Knights of the Blazing Sun, they didn't have the numbers to chase down the remainder of the Beastmen horde. But nonetheless, without a leader, the Beastmen horde scattered into disparate tribes and just spread out amongst the Drakwold and amongst the Middle Mountain. And Hochland, although most of the province still ravaged, Hergig had been saved for what was left of it. And the Empire was victorious that day, but suffering heavy losses that have carved the name of Gorthor into the memories of the citizens of the Empire, as well as carved his names in the immortal herdstones of the Beastmen for many ages to come. Now, Gorthor himself is armed with, as I'd mentioned in the story, he has the Impaler, his spear, which is a magic weapon and thus would do magical damage. He also has his cloak, which was made of the skin of the Bray shamans he'd killed, and this gives him essentially a leadership bonus on the tabletop, but maybe it could give him magic resistance or something else like that in Total War Warhammer. His third item is something called the Skull of Magra, which was a Minotaur lord. So that's the story of Gorthor. Although this did happen 1,000 years ago, he is in the Beastmen. He is included as a named character in the Beastmen 8th edition, but I'm not sure if we're likely to see him in Total War Warhammer, simply because he is so similar to Kazarak. And Kazarak is alive in the sort of Total War Warhammer timeline, and his story very much kind of mirrors Gorthor with Kazarak and Boris, and Gorthor and this Count of Hochland, Mikhail. That's kind of the reason I think Gorthor, we might not see Gorthor, although he is praised as one of the most important beastmen to have ever lived. And sort of time and death hasn't stopped them introducing other characters in the past in Total War Warhammer. I just think his similarity as a Beast Lord to Kazarak might mean that we don't necessarily see Gorthor, unlike Taurox the Brass Bull, which is very much a different kind of general. He's a Minotaur general. It's the kind of general we don't already have in the game. So that's my thinking on Gorthor. I think he's quite a cool character. He has quite a cool little story there and sort of encapsulates the idea of the Beastmen rampaging to end the realm of men, really. So that was Gorthor. Next up, we have Moonclaw, son of Morslib, the lunatic prince, the child of the gravid orb. Now, although he may look like a beastman, Moonclaw is from another place entirely. One dark night on the evening of, I'm going to massacre this pronunciation, but here goes my attempt, Geheimnisnacht, which is a holiday, not really a holiday, a celebration of a time that happens once a year, where the moons of Morslib and Manislib, again, probably butchered that pronunciation, apologies for that, but they're the two moons that exist in the Warhammer world, and it's the evening or the night of them both being at full moon together, and that only happens once a year in the Warhammer world. The two moons both in their full splendor. Morslib hung low, it's said to have hung low in the sky that night, with a full appearance, full in its firmament, much like one of a pregnant hag. And come at the stroke of the witching hour, a meteor that scarred the heavens with a green flame and sported horns in its front was reported to have crashed down from the sky and landed in the barren hills of Talabakland. And it flattened, upon impact, it flattened the forest for miles around, leaving nothing alive except for what crawled out of a egg-shaped meteor that had been made purely from warpstone. Now, warpstone in the Warhammer world, if you don't already know, is essentially pure magic given a physical form. The Skaven, or the rumored Ratmen if you prefer, love warpstone. They use it a lot, but it's essentially magic given, magical power stroke chaos energy given physical form. And out of this egg of essentially magical power crawled an animal with its fur glistening from being covered in just unknown, horrible, stinking, nameless fluids. And it was so mutated and morphed and disfigured, and it did have horns, which made it look slightly like a beastman, but one could barely describe him as such. And this was the birth of Moonclaw. From relatively unknown origins, having fallen from the heavens itself, he spoke in a dark, incomprehensible tongue. When he moved, he cast doppelganger kind of shadows of himself, much like if you ever see in a comic someone moving quickly, but he moves at a normal pace, and it just seems like he kind of multiplies himself through time. His movements are so bizarre. Although no one can really understand what he's saying, through simple gestures and noises, he manages to communicate his will to other beastmen who worship him almost, just due to the dark aura and energy that surrounds him, and the fact wherever he goes, he kind of leaves behind this trail of black and green flame, which the beastmen see as him being blessed by Morslib the moon itself and by the chaos gods as a whole. In terms of his appearance, he has goat-like eyes, much like other beastmen, but they glow, and he seems to stare into middle nothingness, and one gets the impression he's almost looking into another realm of existence, another state of being. He doesn't really register the world as it is, as we see it around us. Some have suggested he even just sees chaos wins, and that's all he sees. He doesn't really see the physical world as we do. Moonclaw, just due to his very nature, attracts beastmen to follow him, just because he does seem to be blessed by the gods and does have this mysterious bringing this power, and his sort of skin crackles and glows from the cracks, and it's just very apparent that this is a very powerful, and from the beastman's perspective, he may as well be a beastman. He's a mutant like them, they believe. And so they follow him. It's said that Moonclaw, when he does enter into fray of battle with his beastmen followers, is strongest when Morozleb is nearest the earth. It gives him enhanced power and allows him, in fact, to summon forth a beast known as Umbraloch to his side. And this is a foul, mutated beast with 2 heads, but that provides Moonclaw with his mount and his steed in times of battle. In terms of his ability to access magic, it's more of a kind of instinctual usage of it. He doesn't really know spells. No one seems to be able to communicate with him to teach him spells. It's just sort of what he knows how to do. And so his magic level in the tabletop, at least, he's only a level 1 mage. So it means he's not the most proficient at magic use, but he does have access to some magic. And this magic allows him to wield the lore of Wild and the lore of Shadows. I think it's either both or one or the other. And he also has the ability to call upon his mother to rain down meteors of warpstone whenever he needs to call them down in battle. I imagine this would look like either the comet spell of the Spell of Heavens, or maybe just like piercing bolts from one of the laws of metal, but with green warpstone raining down upon any of the enemies Moonclaw would have on the battlefield. In terms of what Moonclaw is doing around the Warhammer world, it seems his only mission at this point is to hunt down and destroy any of the waystones that exist in the old world and around the Empire. And the waystones are essentially magical stones put in place by the elves during the first chaos intrusion upon the world of Warhammer that sucks in or dissipates the chaos magics that once covered the entire world but are now regressed back essentially to the poles of the planet. So he's looking to do this both to increase his own power and to allow the fell magics and the fell powers and the powers of the chaos gods to have more influence on the world as a whole. So that's what seems to be his main motivator, or that's where he seems to be guiding his beastmen hordes at the moment. In terms of his abilities, we've talked about his access to the lore of Wild and the lore of Shadow. He's also able to, as said, summon down meteorites of Morozleb, the Warpstone moon itself, to rain down upon its enemies, calling on his mother's aid. He also has an effect on the tabletop called a Wave of Insanity, which on the tabletop both affects the leadership. It can affect a number of different aspects, but affects both allies and enemies to have detrimental effects on them, essentially. And I think in Total War Warhammer, you couldn't really have him causing any kind of ill effects upon his own troops, because it wouldn't really work in the Total War Warhammer setting. So what you'd have is maybe just an aura, either a damaging aura or maybe a leadership debuff for anyone who's around him. I think probably more the leadership debuff would be more in keeping with how his Wave of Insanity ability works. It's just saying that if you look upon him and around him and just the energies that crackle about him, it can drive anyone insane. And that's kind of the idea behind Moonclaw and the ability he has in regards to the Wave of Insanity. But that about sums it up for Moonclaw. He's quite an interesting character. He has a very different beginning, and he has this sort of unique mount. So I think he'd make a great little addition to Total War Warhammer for the Beastmen. Maybe because he has this sort of tie to Morozleb and he's seeking out to destroy Waystones. You could maybe have him on the new continent in Total War Warhammer 2, maybe harassing the elves. Although he didn't necessarily crash down in elven territory, I think his mission to destroy Waystones might just play nicely into the elves. And Total War Warhammer hasn't been shy of moving characters around, not necessarily from their places of origin. So I think he could fit quite nicely on Ulthuan or even on Nagaroth, to give the Dark Elves some trouble over there. So that's where I envisage him being planted, just in terms of the way the game's looking at the moment, if they ever do introduce him, because they will need some lords to fill out the new territories they're building up in Nagaroth, Ulthuan, and Lustria, the home of the Lizardmen, which is, as everyone suspects at this point, will be the three armies that make up Total Warhammer 2. A final aspect I want to mention about Moonclaw is this idea of his strength ebbing and waning with the rising and setting of the moon, Morsleb. Sorry if I've been slaughtering the pronunciation of that, but I just say it how I see it. It might be wrong. I apologize if it is. There is a mechanic for the moon stuff already in Total War Warhammer for the Beastmen, and I think he should play a little bit like, if you guys have played the Wood Elf DLC, and you can assign the Marshal of the Wild Hunt, or whatever the title is officially, and he gets bonuses, but only at certain times when it's sort of spring, and it kind of adds him as like bonuses as a general during certain like periods. I think you could just easily transplant that mechanic, give it to Moonclaw for the passing of the stages of the moon, which the Beastmen already have, and just have him have his abilities buffed, particularly for certain turns in the campaign. I think that would work nicely, and it wouldn't cause them to have too much additional work to do. That's Moonclaw, the son of Morsleb, and that's him. He's a bit of a strange character, very mysterious about where he's really from, what his actual purpose is, because no one can really communicate with him. No one really knows, because he just talks gibberish and kind of potters about, and people just have, and the Beastmen just due to their nature and their beliefs just follow him around. So that's Moonclaw, and moving on, we have Ghorros Warhoof, the sire of 1,000 young. Ghorros is not one of the heroes included in the 8th edition of the game, but is included in the 7th edition, and he's a bit unique in that he is a Centaur Legendary Lord, which isn't really an option elsewhere in the Beastmen category, and I think it'd be great to have a Centaur Legendary Lord, essentially a mounted cavalry Legendary Lord, in Total War Warhammer for the Beastmen, so I've included Ghorros in this. Now, Ghorros himself is a gnarled and ancient Centaur. He's said to have led an unnaturally long life, but he's always had boundless energy, always fighting, rotting, or like many of his kind, getting absolutely plastered drunk. He has this unholy vitality within him, and as I said, this kind of boundless energy, and also particularly noted is his virility. The veteran of countless wars, Ghorros is known as the sire of 1,000 young. Now, this name doesn't seem to do him justice. Ghorros has for centuries been marching around the Warhammer world, rotting with anything that would have him, and I'm sure even things that didn't want him as well. As such, he has fathered countless young across countless war herds, across numerous different species around the Warhammer world. As such, he has links of lineage to almost every known beast herd clan in the old world, and is a much known and admired character amongst the Beastmen legions. Ghorros is typical of many drunkards, a very boastful chap. He often talks about his adventures, and you'd actually have a hard time getting him to shut up about them if you ever encountered him, and he didn't decide to eviscerate you on the spot. He likes to boast that every single member of the Centaur race can now trace their lineage back to him due to the amount of children he has sired over the centuries, if not millennia. Like his kin, when he is drunk, he is often prone to a violent outburst, which is not particularly a point of note among Centaurs, as many of them display quite similar character traits. But despite all these character flaws, when he rides into battle, few foes can hope to match his strength and martial prowess, just due to his immense experience of essentially fighting his whole life, and that life is a particularly long-lived one. He is hard to match for anyone on the battlefield. In terms of his campaigns and stuff, not much is written about Ghorros' sort of war record and exactly what campaigns he was involved in, but he does have a couple of traits that are pretty interesting on the tabletop game. The first is his Sons of Ghorros special rule, and that's because when he does ride into battle, he rides into battle with the strongest and most fearsome of his Centaur sons, and these form a unit known as the Sons of Ghorros. Now, if we don't see Ghorros himself, if we ever get around to seeing regiments of renown for the Beastmen, I'm pretty sure one, if not the Centaur regiment of renown, will be the Sons of Ghorros. On the tabletop, they essentially get an additional weapon skill point, but in Total War Warhammer, that could translate as anything. They could be faster, or they could just have better melee attack, or they could have reach. They could have anything. It's a bit up in the air in terms of what they'll actually get on the tabletop. But my theory is that these guys would be the Regiment of Renown if we don't see Ghorros himself make an appearance in Total War Warhammer itself. In terms of his other abilities on the tabletop, because he has all these family linkages to the other Beastmen clan, and he's well regarded, and theory is that not even just Centaurs, but he'd have fathered Ungrals, he'd have fathered Ghors. They might be sort of half-breeds and mutants, but he's really just multiplied with anything. I think Ghorros maybe takes the horrible saying, any hole's a goal, to new levels, and really he probably has a harpy half-son somewhere that probably exploded within his mother when he was born, or something like that. But Ghorros has had hundreds of thousands of, maybe not hundreds of thousands, but definitely thousands of children. And these often form the ranks of his war herd. So if he is ever struck down, he has a trait known as Father of Beasts, where if he's ever beaten in a battle, the rest of the army gets a leadership bonus, actually, because they're so enraged that someone cut down the Father of Beasts, that they launch anew into the fray and with renewed vigor and fight harder, that being the idea. I'm not sure how you'd necessarily translate that rule across to Total War Warhammer. Maybe just give him Father of Beast traits, which is just a leadership bonus in general while he's alive. He doesn't have to be dead for anyone to benefit from it. In terms of his gear, he's armed with his club known as Man Smasher. Truly original in his naming, old Ghorros. But that's a spiked club that's had the blessings of many Bray Shaman on it, and it has long soaked in the blood of ancient royal dynasties. So that's given it some magical damage ability, the Man Smasher. He has a helmet, which is called the Skull of the Unicorn Lord, and it's made from the skull of the unicorn that was once known as Arsil. Now, Arsil was a prince among unicorns, and as such, when Ghorros slew him and decided to wear his skull as a hat, it enraged all wood elves who have a close relationship with unicorns, and thusly, whenever he meets wood elves in battle, at least on the tabletop, they would have the hatred rule against him, which would allow them to have a greater chance of striking him on the tabletop. There is the hates trait on the campaign map, so I think if any army came into contact, well, wood elves already hate all beastmen anyway, so it wouldn't make much of a difference there. But yeah, any wood elf army would maybe have special bonus traits against fighting Ghorros, because of their hatred towards him for killing the prince of the unicorns. And that about sums it up for Ghorros. I think he's just a fun character, just a drunken, boisterous old centaur that has legions of children all over the world, the typical absent father, as it were, and he just goes around smashing humans, drinking, having sex, losing his temper, and telling stories. And that's Ghorros, and I think he'd make a great legendary lord to be added to the Beastmen ranks. Next up, we have Ungrol Four-Horn. Now, Ungrol, like Ghorros, was mentioned in the 7th edition of Beastmen, but wasn't covered as an 8th edition character. But because he's slightly different, he's not just a Beast Lord, he's actually an Ungrol Legendary Lord, as it were. And, well, to a certain degree. I'll explain that when we get to his story. But essentially, he's not just a typical sort of Ghor Beast Lord like Kazarak or like Gorthor. He's a little bit different, and that's why I included him in this list today. Ungrol Four-Horn, otherwise known as Blackheart, the Horn Thief, or the Spurned One, actually began life born to human parents. And he was born with 2 heads, and so ugly was he that his parents could, after a couple of years, no longer stand to look at him. He'd started to sprout hair. He was truly disgusting, and they realized that he was actually turning into what looked like an approximation of a beastman. So one, I imagine, even as a baby or as an infant, I'm not 100% sure when they did this, but they wrapped him up, took him out to the woods, and left him there to die. They didn't want him. He was a ugly, horrible mutation, and he revolted his parents. So they threw him into the woods, but yet he managed to survive, even as this baby or toddler, He managed to start to live on grubs and roots, and eventually grew big enough to be able to hunt and kill for food instead. And after years of kind of surviving on his own, hunting game and eating grubs and roots and surviving that way, this mutation managed to get himself included into the Man-Blight tribe. Now, he joined the Man-Blight tribe as an Ungrol, and the only reason they kind of put up with him, knowing he wasn't really kind of full beast man, was because of this mutation, these two heads. They thought it a remarkable blessing from the Chaos Gods. So amongst the Ungrol ranks, he could sort of wander around, and people tolerated him because of this horrid mutation he had. But even then, he didn't find acceptance among the Beastmen. His fellow Ungrors, who are kind of the lowest rung of the social ladder amongst Beastmen, hated him because they were jealous of his double-headed mutation, and they spurned him and weren't particularly nice and didn't want to be his mate. And on the other hand, for the Ghors, horn size is everything, and all Ungrol ever really had were two little horn buds, nothing to show off really at all. And so the Ghors would typically mock him and frequently beat him whenever they got bored or were drunk enough just to find something to entertain themselves. And eventually, after years of this, day by day, being spurned by his fellow Ungrors as an outcast and being beaten up by the Ghors for having his tiny little horn buds and nothing to show for it in the horn department. And the Ghors, due to Ungrol's tiny little horn buds, often mocked him and called him Four-Horns as a mocking gesture towards him, because obviously he barely had what one could call horns at all. He snapped. He got beaten that day, he was bleeding from his wounds, and one night, after a feast, particularly dark night of a new moon, after a feast for which he was not allowed to attend because of his low status within the herd, Ungrol managed to sneak up on the leaders of the Man-Blight herd and picked up a great rock, making out the shape of the largest of the herd, the Beast Lord, the chief of the herd. He raised the great rock above his head and brought it crashing down on the skull of the Beastman chief. Promptly after this, he moved on to try and track down the Bray Shaman, who's often the number 2 of the herd, and strangled the Bray Shaman with his own hands, not allowing him to chant any of his dark magics to strike back at Ungrol. Having killed them both, he took his jagged knife, started to carve off their horns, and he attached each set of horns to one of his 2 heads, and in his bloodlust and slight madness at just being beaten and persecuted for all these years, he wandered away from the tribe and found a clearing where he could see himself, he could see his shadow in the moonlight, and started to launch into a manic little dance in his empty glade, all the while singing to himself, "Four-Horns, Four-Horns, Four-Horns, Four-Horns," and relishing in his little victory after so many years of abuse. So, having woken up to find their chieftain slain, which is a bad enough sin in itself to kill a chieftain outside of a challenge, and to find their Bray Shaman slain as well, which is a grave sin in its own right, the herd set about trying to hunt Ungrol down. But Ungrol, always being the sly little sneak, managed to escape into a labyrinth of caves nearby, and they never managed to track him down. It said he still dwells within those caves today. Now, such was the level of Ungrol's crimes against his herd, against his chieftain, against the Bray Shaman, that this legend started to spread of Ungrol Four-Horn. And any other beastman who'd been set aside or spurned by their clan or had too much of a mutation to exist in human society, all of these people started to gravitate towards Ungrol. And before he knew it, he'd formed this kind of army of misfits. He'd started to lead them all as a kind of beggar king, and he managed to build up a war herd of his own. Fair enough, it wasn't necessarily made out of the strongest and mightiest of what the Beastmen had to offer, but it grew in size and became a sizable force in its own right. And such is the hatred within Ungrol that he managed to begin to use it and channel it towards becoming a not bad melee fighter himself, and soon started to become a fighter of some repute, actually, in Beastmen circles. So having now has his underground army of the outcasts of beastmen and humans, and having his skills being proven and sort of his reputation growing, we find Ungrol at the moment still in his underground dwelling with this herd around him, looking to maybe strike out and take advantage of any vulnerable targets within the Empire itself. And that's kind of the current state of affairs with Ungrol. And I just think it's a good, interesting general to maybe add to Total War Warhammer, who isn't necessarily a typical Gore Beast Lord, but has a bit of a different story, and maybe gets, if you ever did introduce him, give him bonuses to the Ungors and the and maybe Harpies, and maybe the lesser strength units within a Total War Warhammer game. Much like Skarsnik makes goblins a fearsome force to behold, maybe Ungrol could make Ungors, give them the appropriate boosts of stats to make them a fearsome fighting force in their own right. Now, in terms of his gear, he has the stolen crowns, essentially, and this is because with the sort of granting of magic and just the way some stuff works in the Warhammer world, the two sets of horns from the Chieftain and the Brave Shaman have conveyed unto Ungrol some of their powers. And in the tabletop, you'd roll to see which of the sets of horns he'd benefit from. So benefiting from the Chieftain's horns, he'd get a bonus to sort of weapon skill and I think his strength level as a whole. And if you rolled and you got him getting the benefits of the Brave Shaman's horns, he'd become a level 1 wizard with Lore of the Wild. So he'd have some Lore of the Wild spells. Now, Total War Warhammer doesn't really do levels, so essentially you could maybe get him, he'd probably have Lore of the Wild and maybe just particularly make him a half-decent fighter as a legendary lord anyway, and that would sort of apply to the stolen crowns that he wears as his gear. He also has a special rule called Bruised and Bitter, where he hates all of those who have wronged him. So that's the realms of men, being Bretonnia and the Empire, and Beastmen themselves. So he'd have hate towards the Empire, Bretonnia, and other Beastmen armies as a personality trait, ideally, on the Total War Warhammer game. But that about sums it up for Ungrol. I think he could add an interesting little element that doesn't exist for generals in the Beastmen faction as it stands today. So that's why I include him in the list, although he isn't necessarily mentioned in the 8th edition stuff. It would be good to have him as he offers something a little bit different. And last, but by no means least, we have Molokh Slugtongue, the Barren One, Lord of the Black Harvest. Now, Slugtongue is effectively the cold talon of winter incarnate. He stalks across the lands of men, described as a black hobbled crow. He has the ability to completely devastate any sort of aspect of nature or anything or any way that men have altered nature from what Slugtongue perceives as its natural wild state. So he can take fertile farmland and cause it to become a barren, frozen wasteland. He can whisper a simple phrase and unleash blight upon the land, summoning hordes of skull-faced locusts that can form hurricane swarms that can clear fields and leave nothing but dirt and dust in its wake in a matter of moments. His gargling, phlegm-choked laughter can turn a beautiful spring into a festering puddle of ooze and bile and sickness. A simple word from his mouth can cause rain clouds to form overhead and rain down living maggots upon any below. They will eat up the field and spread disease wherever they land, much like a living hailstorm of sorts. It's said that when he passes granaries and storehouses of men where they keep their food supplies for winter, whenever those are reopened, all they find is black sludge, and in the barrels of ale in those storehouses have been reverted to spittle and vomit, and are just unusable by any humans who have survived the passing of the Beastman Horde. Now, what Slugtongue is looking to do is to promote famine and starve out the realms of men. As I said, he's very much against any way they've looked to tame nature for their own benefit, and wants the world to revert back to its natural state, where, of course, beastmen are the predominant power within the forests of the old world. And in his effort to do this is why he takes on this form and uses all this magic, because he knows wherever famine is, war follows, as surely as winter follows autumn. He's betting on it, and he keeps his war herd well fed with the bodies of the victims they collect, eating down on man flesh wherever they go. And eventually, having starved out these humans, he knows that humans will come to him for the fight. They'll always be forced to ride out if he ruins their food stores, because they'll have no choice but to try and hunt down the source of this plague, of any blight that's affecting their farmland, and try and cut it out of the heart of their province. He's counting on them charging down and meeting him in his horde in open combat in the open field, in which case they're already probably quite starving and malnourished compared to his well-fed and hot-tempered and bloodlusting war herd that immediately manages to chop down and consume any army that's sent against him. Now, in terms of his appearance, Slugtongue is a hideous-looking creature. His head is little more than a bovine skull. His body is emaciated and covered in white hair and liver spots. But if you look a little bit closer, you can see that his body is really just a host for a bunch of horrible parasites. His body is teeming with colonies of fat black lice, hopping fleas and bloated ticks, wriggling worms, and stink-bodied cockroaches that all live within the crevices of his body itself. It's said that centipedes are often seen to crawl between the empty sockets of his eyes, and slugs pop out from between the gaps in his teeth. He truly is a vile and horrendous-looking creature to gaze upon. In fact, in terms of himself, if you were to approach him, he has an aura of cold and numbing cold that surrounds him, so much so that his breath is always visible, and it coalesces into sinister shapes that seem to foretell great doom and destruction upon anyone who witnesses them. His robes hang off him, said to form icicles of some kind of filthy and unimaginable liquid. That is the degree to which he manages to lessen the temperature around him. In terms of his gear and how he might appear on the tabletop, Slugtongue would have the ability of poison attacks, of regeneration. He'd have access to both the laws of wild and the laws of death. This cold aura around him is, on the tabletop, all it does is cause damage. But with what they introduced for the chill guys, it might be interesting to have the aura maybe cause damage around him like a mortis engine, but also cause slow around him like the chill guys do at the Regiment of Renown for the vampire counts. So I think he could have that sort of double header of aura abilities just due to his nature. I think he'd make a very interesting alternative as a magical lord when compared to Malagor, the Dark Omen. I think he offers a great alternative, and it's a very sort of different legendary lord. And I think particularly once they get Malagor flying, because I think Total War Warhammer definitely needs flight on and off mode for flyers. So you don't have to have them in the air. So you don't get the situation where you have your legendary lord in the air and in a multiplayer battle, the other team just has more flying units. So there's really little you can do short of suicidally charging your lord into the enemy units. Whereas in reality, what you really have to do is just land them and they'd be safe as houses. So I think they do need to introduce a flight mode on and off for Total War Warhammer. And once Malagor gets that, Molokh Slugtongue would be an interesting alternative to the playstyle of, Malagor, the Dark Omen. So that's really Slugtongue, and that kind of concludes our Beastmen Missing Legendary Lords Beastmen edition. I hope you guys enjoyed that. It was a fun one to do. Again, a lot of these Legendary Lords don't necessarily have a huge amount of lore in terms of their battles and the campaigns they've won, but in terms of who they are and their abilities and their characters, I think there's a lot to offer here from the perspective of Total War Warhammer. I think in particular, I'd love to see the Centaur Legendary Lord, and I'd love to see, and maybe even the Ungrol one, Ungrol, just because I don't want, Gorthor I'm a little bit less enthused about. He is sort of legendary, as it were, but he doesn't really offer anything different. He's a bit too much like Kazarak in the first place, or just the generic legendary lord for beastmen anyway. Not legendary lord, the generic lord for beastmen anyway. So I'd like to see something a little bit different offered in terms of the Beastmen Legendary Lords. But hope you guys enjoyed that. I'll pop up some videos now, or will have done a couple of seconds ago, just showing you some of the other videos on offer from the channel. Please do subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this, some gameplay from Total War Warhammer, and I'd like to keep you all updated with the news as well from Total War Warhammer while we're at it. So thanks very much for joining me on this one, and hopefully see you guys on the next one. Have a great day.